All right, looks like we are right at noon, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Myra Snell, Executive Director of the California Acceleration Project, and we are joined today by Dr. Charity Watson, who is a professor at Florida International University. Dr. Charity Watson will be presenting the results of a large randomized controlled trial conducted by her and her colleagues at a large Hispanic-serving university that compared traditional lecture-based instruction as a control with interactive pedagogy and curriculum called the Modeling Practices in Calculus curriculum, which was the treatment. I was so impressed when I read this study in Science. It was under the title, Establishing a New Standard of Care for Calculus Using Trials with Randomized Student Allocation. What a wonderful title, I thought. And that we would think about a standard of care in calculus rather than the traditional weeded out, beat them up kind of approach that students often experience in that course was exciting to me. This study examined not only calculus success, final exam performance, changes in pre-calculus skill proficiency, changes in math attitudes, but it focused on historically marginalized STEM populations, women, and students who were deemed underprepared, which I think will be of particular interest to community college faculty. Dr. Watson also has published a more in-depth look at students with weaker calculus skills in the impact of this intervention on those students in the International Journal of Mathematical Education, Science, and Technology. And that was titled The Supportive Role of Active Learning in a Calculus Course on Low Pre-Calculus Proficiency Students. Both of these articles can be found on the CAP website at accelerationproject.org under events. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted within about a week on the CAP website under publications. We are going to be using a Q&A format, and I will be monitoring the questions as they come in. If I see any questions that are clarifying questions, Dr. Watson has agreed to be interrupted to provide clarification. Otherwise, we're going to handle all of the questions at the end of the presentation. Okay, without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Charity Watson.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I am really happy to be speaking with you all today. Thank you so much, Myra, for inviting me to, just share some of the work that we've been doing here at FIU. All right, so as you can see, the name of this talk is just Establishing a New Standard of Care for STEM Calculus, Results from a Randomized Control Trial. So there we go. Okay, so I'll just start just by just kind of talking about something that many of you are probably aware of, and that's kind of like some issues that are currently in university calculus. So a lot of focus has been placed on calculus just due to its role as a gatekeeper in STEM and the sheer number of students who enrolled in this course each semester, right? So it's kind of known that pass rates are low while drop rates tend to be pretty high for this course. And we know that these drop rates especially kind of attribute to the attrition rates that we see in students pursuing STEM degrees. And so one of the factors that's been attributed to the students struggling is their lack of foundational skills, right? So students are expected to use pre-calc concepts and those skills in order to solve calculus problems. So if they have a weakness or some misconceptions, that can hinder them being able to do that. But also not only that, calculus also has an effect on students' attitudes towards math. Right, so studies have shown that students going through a semester of calculus led to a strong decrease in confidence, enjoyment, and desire to continue in math. All right, so this also attributes to some of those attrition rates that we see. So when we think about these issues in calculus, there's some populations of interest that we tend to focus on. The first being historically underrepresented minorities and also female identified students, because there are difficulties retaining minorities and women in STEM courses and majors. Also underclassmen and STEM intended majors. So only about 40% of incoming freshmen intending to major in STEM actually complete a STEM degree. And then also kind of like what I was talking about before, students who are considered underprepared. So students who may come into calculus with not the strongest foundational skills. All right, so in light of that, the motivation of this project. So overall, this project was born out of an institutional and national calls to improve mathematics and particularly calculus instruction. So the institution where I am, Florida International, they are committed to establishing a culture of evidence-based and inclusive STEM instruction, right? So when they noticed that there were some issues happening in STEM and that a lot of them came from calculus, they were interested in how to make that better for our students. Now, a lot of talk has been had about how using student-centered instructional techniques can help with that, right? It's been kind of a recent focus for these improvements to instruction. Probably one of the most popular studies on active learning is the Freeman study from, I believe, 2014, which found that active learning leads to learning gains in various STEM courses. So a lot of those things do focus on student achievement, which of course we know is important. But what we also kind of like should be interested in is how does it impact other factors, right? So something besides achievement and persistence, right? So how does it affect students like interest in math or their attitudes towards math, or even like how it can impact their skills that they may be a little bit weak on. All right, so I'll just give you a little bit of information about FIU. So we are a public R1 institution located in Miami-Dade County. We have about 58,000 students. That number was accurate as of 2022, I think, but I think it should still be around there. The majority of our students are from historically underrepresented groups. We are an HSI, Hispanic-serving institution, so the majority of our students are also Hispanic. So the STEM Transformation Institute, which is where I work, is an institute that kind of houses faculty from various STEM fields. And we all do discipline-based education research, right? So all of us are focused on implementing evidence-based practices and also increasing the number of STEM professionals. And within the STEM TI, we have like multiple change initiatives that are already happening. So one of them being FIU Teach. This is a program that gives STEM students the opportunity to earn a teaching certificate while gaining their STEM degree. So it's not necessarily for education majors. It's for people who want to major in STEM, but also want to, if they want to teach after they graduate, they have that opportunity to do so. Also the LA program, which is something that was very vital to this particular model that I'm going to be telling you guys about today. So LAs are our learning assistants. So these are students who have successfully taken a course. So they took the course, they passed it and all that good stuff. And then they are placed in the classroom to serve as learning facilitators. All right, so, and we call them learning assistants as opposed to teaching assistants because they are placed in the classroom for the student. They are not there to help us actually like teach or grade or anything like that. They are there to be a support for the students. All right, so just some history of Calculus 1 at FIU prior to this project. So it was pretty problematic. The pass rates averaged around 52%, but this varied widely among all the sections. Some sections got as low as 13% pass rates, some got as high as like 85, right? And so there was a lot of variation. Students just weren't doing well. And of course, this contributes to a longer graduation time, which is something that universities find important, that students are getting out on time. All right, so based on all of that, we wanted to do something that would help these students succeed in this particular course, right? So that brings us to the model itself. All right, so we call this the Modeling Practices in Calculus model. And the project officially began in fall 2018. And it's part of an NSF-funded project known as the Catalyzing Change in Calculus project. All right, so it was developed at FIU. Oh, also let me mention, modeling is a word that whenever we talk about it, a lot of people, I think they think of mathematical modeling, which we probably should have been a little bit more cognizant of that when we named it. But what we mean by modeling is that we actually wanted students to model the practices of mathematicians. And so it's how do we get students to actually model these practices? And that's where the word modeling came from. All right, so the overall goal of this is for the environment to be very student-centered and lecture reduced. All right, and we also incorporate the use of LAs in our class. So some things that we emphasize during class time. The biggest one is group work. So when you walk into a classroom using this MPC model, what you should see are students working in small groups. Also formative and immediate feedback, all right? And so you'll see kind of in the picture down here on the bottom, you see a student kind of holding up a whiteboard. So we use these whiteboards not only for students to share the work with each other, but also as the instructor and the LAs kind of like circle around the classroom, we can see their work, right? And so if there's something that we want to point out to them, if there's something that we want to give feedback on, we can do that immediately. And them working on this whiteboards makes it a lot easier than us just trying to look at, if they're just writing on like a single sheet of paper. Also, something that we focus on in the class is correct and logical mathematical notation and representations. And I'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about the features of the model. And then finally, something that we do is something we call reactive lecturing, right? So we said that this is a lecture-reduced environment. So reactive lecturing means that what we do is if we notice that there is a particular concept or topic that multiple groups or students are struggling with, we'll kind of like take a pause, tell everybody to come back together, and that's what we will kind of quote unquote lecture on at that time, right? And so it really just depends on what the students need at that time, which kind of determines how we're going to quote unquote lecture for the day, right? And then also that is kind of like a whole class discussion is what will make that, right? So actually let me pause here. Myra, are we good? Are there any clarifying questions that I can answer?
Right. We are good.
We're good.
Keep going.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Okay, so from here, let's talk about some of the main features of the model. All right, so the first one, what I was talking about with that small group work is cooperative learning. All right, so the students work in small groups, and this helps to facilitate a social aspect in the classroom with the students being able to communicate their mathematical ideas, right? So it's kind of like this peer-to-peer, this supportive kind of learning environment for the students. The second one is mathematical fluency, where we expect students to present their work in a logical way that can be justified and understood by others. So that's something that we want to kind of like always stress the students is that, math is a language and I should be able to understand what it is that you are trying to communicate to me with your ideas. So we do place quite an emphasis on that, along with using correct notation and representations in their work. Metacognition and argumentation. So students are encouraged to justify their claims and their ideas to their peers. All right, so this does help to foster meaningful discourse in each class. As you're walking around, you'll hear students kind of like arguing, but not really about, no, I think we should do it this way, or no, we should do it that way. And really what the answer is you can probably do it both ways. You're probably going to end up with the same answer. But having those discussions for students are very meaningful, right? Because they tend to think that there's only one right way to solve a problem, and that's not always the case, right? And then finally, a culturally appropriate environment. So in this, by allowing students to do all of these things, what we're allowing them to do is to construct their own understanding, right? We're allowing them to take agency over their own learning. So they are indeed being active learners as opposed to just passive learners in these classrooms, right? Also, they have their LAs and their peers to support their learning, right? So it's not just the instructor, it's not just me who's like handing them this knowledge. They have a support system in the classroom who's going to help them, right? So all of these features are what we really try to emphasize within this model to help students to learn calculus. All right, so you're probably wondering, well, so what's a typical day look like in one of these classrooms, right? So what normally happens is that at the beginning of each day, we introduce a new concept, right? Now, this introduction can go different ways, just depending on what the concept is, right? But there could be an overview of like a particular class before. So let's say before we start related rates problem, we might do an overview of implicit differentiation, just to remind them of how we do that and like, hey, now we're going to learn how to apply that particular concept. But what we always give them are what we call guided notes. All right. And so these are notes that we have made. And what they're intended to do is to guide students through the topics with examples that are work for them, but also some examples that we expect them to work out on their own. Right. So again, what they end up having is at the end of the semester, they kind of have their own like set of notes that they have notes for, and they also have like, you know, all the important concepts, anything to reference at the end and all that good stuff. Right. So after that, after we introduce the topic, after we go through some of the notes with them and all that good stuff, the next thing that we do is they get what we call a learning activity, right? And this learning activity is meant to be completed in their groups. So that's when they work on their whiteboards. We may give them specific questions to work on the whiteboards, and then we may ask them to present that particular question. All right, so the learning activity will always complement the notes, but it also, we try to get them to lead them to a little bit more of a higher order thinking than maybe like what they saw in the notes. So maybe adding a few more steps, maybe bringing in some concepts from like a previous class or something like that for them to also incorporate into that. So the whiteboarding and quizzes, like I said before, we use that to give them feedback, right? So as we see them working, we can make a point like, hey, this is really good. Like, I like how you work through this solution, or hey, maybe like check your step here. That's probably like why you're having trouble with, you know, figuring this out and all that good stuff, right? So after that, we kind of do bringing it all back together with everyone with what we call board meetings or group presentations. So sometimes we'll have each group present a particular problem to the class. And this is also where that mathematical fluency comes in, because we want to make sure that whatever work you do can be understood by others, right? So we want to make sure the other groups can understand, oh, yes, I understand like what you did here, how you got to your answer and all that good stuff, right? So again, all of this is being facilitated by the instructor and by the LAs, right? So we are just walking around, answering questions, kind of engaging the students to actually discuss with each other and all that good stuff. All right, so yeah, so that is kind of like a general overview of what a typical day in this model would look like. All right, so from here, so yes, so now I will get into the study itself. All right, so we were able to utilize a randomized controlled trial to assess the impact of this model on the calculus students. So we ran this RCT across 3 semesters, so fall 18, spring 19, and fall 19, for a total of 16 sections of treatment, or the MPC, and then 16 sections of control, which we just call non-MPC. All right, so kind of the way that we were able to do this. So we were able to get double capacity sections for Calculus 1. So we normally have a cap of about 40 students in our Calculus 1 class. And so the registrar was able to make a section with like double that, right? So like 80. All the students saw was the time and the, maybe no, not even the location. They just saw the time of the class when they were registering, right? So all they knew is that this class works with my schedule. They did not see an instructor. They did not see, oh, you're in a treatment section. They saw none of that, right? So all they saw was the time of it. All right, so about 3 days or so before the semester started, that's when each of those sections was then kind of like split into half. So students were randomly assigned to either an MPC class or a non-MPC class, right? And so at that time, that's when students saw the name of their instructor. Still had no clue, just based on the schedule, if they were in an MPC course or a non-MPC course. All they knew is that, okay, now I have an instructor. I know who I'm going to see when I show up to class on the first day of class. All right. So yes, so that is how we did that. We wanted to look at multiple measures of student outcomes. Of course, course outcomes. So we were interested in pass rates, drop rates, all that good stuff. We also looked at some final exam data. All right, so we wanted to look at how students were performing at the end of the semester when we compare the two. We also wanted to look at some affective things. So we wanted to look at their attitudes towards math. So we wanted to know if this model was maybe helping students to improve their attitudes when they think of math. And then also pre-calculus proficiency. So we knew that the students who were coming in tended to be maybe a little bit weaker when it came to pre-calculus skills. And so we were also interested in, well, could this model actually be helping them with those skills while they're actually learning calculus? All right. So the way that we measured the attitudes towards math was just using an inventory known as the Attitudes Towards Mathematics Inventory, which is the ATMI. All right, so it is a 40-item Likert scale inventory that measures enjoyment, motivation, self-confidence, and value. And we administered that at the beginning and end of the semester to get a pre-post. And then also for the pre-calc proficiency, we use the PCA, the pre-calculus concept assessment, which is known to be a valid and reliable measure of those skills. That's a 25-item multiple choice inventory, again, administered at the beginning and the end of the semester, and we scored that out of 25. So I will say now, the students never knew how they scored on either of these inventories because we weren't using it to decide like anything about their status in the course or anything about them. We literally just wanted to know how they compared from the beginning to the end, right? And these inventories were given in both the control and the treatment sections, right? All right, so let's look at just some course outcome results for now, all right? So I'll start with this one just because it's probably the one that gives the best picture of the course outcome results. So just looking at the overall results, it shows that our model was pretty successful as far as course outcomes go, right? So the one on the left is the course success, which is if a student was successful in the course, so if they passed or not. And we can see that overall, the MPC courses was indeed more successful in getting students to pass the course, right, based on that effect size. But then even like when we broke it out by certain like key demographics, right? So by gender, a few race, ethnicity. Also, we looked at their class status. So if they were a transfer student versus like first time in college, and then some majors. So for Calc 1 at FIU, it's a STEM course, right? But we have mainly biology majors. They're usually like pre-med majors. And so we were interested in how the pre-med majors or like those biology majors were doing, which is why we looked at that particular major, all right? So for the course success, we saw like, you know, some good effect sizes, mostly small, but where we saw the most dramatic was in those final exams. So these are our end of semester learning measures where we administered common exams to students in both the control and the treatment sections. And then after that, so after the instructors had graded them, assigned the grades, we took those exams and we blinded them all so that we had no idea if it came from a treatment section or a control section, right? And then we asked some graders for us or some evaluators for us to then grade these exams using a particular rubric. And then from there, we compared how they did, right? And so that is what these effect sizes in particular are telling us. And I think the thing that stands out the most here is that every single one of the differences that we see for the overall group, but also for those key demographics that we were talking about, they were all significant, right? So everyone is performing significantly better on their final exam in the treatment group when compared to the control group, right? The biggest one is for the biology majors, which is, I was saying, they're the majority of what we see in our calculus courses. And so that was something that was very important to us. But also for our female students, we also see a significant difference there, which is also something important to us because we knew that female students tend to be the ones who either just didn't do as well or just end up dropping the course. So we were very happy with these results. All right, so kind of just some breaking down some of those course success. So of course, like I said, we were interested in the course passing rates, just seeing how the students in the treatment sections were doing compared to the control section. So across each semester, we saw improved pass rates and decreased drop rates. But also something that we see is that they're very consistent across each semester, right? So every semester we were doing pretty good with getting like less students to drop our course and getting more students to pass the course, which is of course exactly what we want. So if you remember before, I said that those pass rates before we started this project, they varied widely across the semesters, but then they were averaging around like 52% or so. And so the fact that we were able to get them up this high, again, was a very good thing for us. We found that to be very encouraging in those results. Right. So the other course outcome, the final exam results. All right. So here is where, so this is just spring 19 and fall 19. But here's where we kind of broke out the results by the problem type, right? So as you can see, the type of final exam questions that we have are pretty typical for a calculus course, right? We have some just kind of procedural stuff, but then also some applied and conceptual problems and things like that. And again, each time we see that the students were doing really well when compared to the control students in the treatment sections. Now, there are some where we see that maybe this topic didn't go quite as well for control or treatment, right? So something such as like applied optimization, that one tends to be like on like the lower side when we scored. But again, still the fact that the students in the treatment sections were doing so much better still gave us, some hope. And especially something that we noticed was that for those conceptual and applied problems is how well the students in the treatment sections were doing, right? And so that it wasn't just kind of like they just know how to do like just the procedures, but not necessarily how to apply it. But know that, okay, they can actually take what they've learned and apply them to different types of problems. And that was something that was very encouraging for us to see. Right. Oh, I will pause here again. Myra, are we still good?
I think some of the questions we're getting might be better handled at the end.
Okay.
So
Okay.
let's keep going and we'll circle back.
Okay, sounds good. All right. Okay, so now let's look at some changes in attitudes. All right, so I actually, this one is always fun to show. I actually just kind of want to see if there's something that we notice like immediately from this. And it might be hard if it's just like the Q&A. I don't know, are they able to unmute to say anything? But yeah.
Are you wanting people to say what they see here?
Yeah, just like kind of like something that stands out or something that they notice. Yeah.
So I have this set up as a Q&A. So folks, if you
Okay.
notice something that you want to highlight, you could type it in as a question. I'll tell you one thing I'm noticing.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of upward.
Yep.
Not a lot of upward movement.
Yeah. I mean, and that's, yes, that is exactly what what we noticed. Now, these particular results, they weren't super surprising just because given previous studies, they show a decrease in attitudes after a semester of calculus. It's just, there's something about calculus that causes students to be like, I'm over this. No, I hate math more than I did before I came in here, right? But there were some things that still gave us, again, some good feelings, some things that say, okay, well, it's not as bad as it was before. And it's that the negative slope that we see in the treatment sections, some of them aren't even a negative slope, right? Some of them, they just didn't have a change. And so it's like, okay, so maybe their attitudes didn't get better, but at least they didn't get worse. But also is that for self-confidence and enjoyment, when we compare the 2 semesters, that at the end of the semester, the treatment students felt a lot better about those things when compared to the control treatments, right? So it seems that like when compared to the control students, the students in the NPC sections actually felt a lot more confidence about like how they could perform in math. And they also seemed to enjoy it more than like the students in the other sections. Now it seems like value is the one that constantly has the negative slope, even though it's still kind of high up there. So students still tend to kind of see the value in math a little bit more, but there's still that decline, right? And so, yeah. So again, we still take kind of some solace in the fact that that magnitude of the negative impact that calculus tends to cause is still significantly smaller, right? So then another thing that we looked at was kind of like some of these changes in attitude by gender, right? So we were interested in particularly like how female students were being impacted by this particular model. And so what we actually found was that the NPC model is actually having a significant effect on female students' attitudes, right? So we especially see this in self-confidence, where we see that in the control sections, the self-confidence of the female students got significantly worse. And for the treatment students, while that difference isn't significant, there was still an upward slope there. And also, they are way more confident than the female students in the control sections, right? So, and also something that we noticed is that when comparing the male and female students for the post, is that female students were reporting levels of confidence that were comparable to their male counterparts, right? And so we kind of see this as the NPC model kind of working as kind of like a gender equalizer when it comes to self-confidence in our students, which is also something that is very encouraging for us to be able to know about, right?
Okay, so Charity, there are a few, I think, clarifying questions here.
Okay.
So several questions in this sort of genre that folks noticed in both of these attitudes charts that the treatment group started out in the pre just slightly higher than the control group. And they wondered if one person phrased it this way, was there something that happened on the first day or two before testing was done that could have led to this slight difference in the pre-scores?
You know, that is a very good question. If it is, it's probably not something that we could have discerned, probably not something that we could have measured. We did make sure that these exams were given during the first week of classes so that, you know, there was as little, I guess, I don't want to call it contamination, but as little like, you know, whatever as possible. So that's a good question. Now, I will also say that this is, of course, the match data. So this is data from students who took the pre and the post, right? So that means that they had to stick around throughout the whole semester in order to be incorporated in the thing that you see here. So that could also play a role in what we see. Maybe like the students who stuck around just already kind of had higher attitudes towards mathematics. But that's something, again, that we'd have to, I don't know if we can look into the data more, or yeah, I think that will require a little bit more for us to know exactly.
Well,
Yep.
for me, one thing I'm noticing is that though that is a true statement that the treatment groups had a little higher initial, and sometimes, you know, I don't know, what would that be? Maybe 0.05 on the scale as a mean. But relative to the change that happened over the course, those initial differences are very small. But I do think that the question of what might have happened, even just in the first week of class, it is an interesting one. All right, so another person who came in late, could you just clarify one more time quickly, what does MPC stand for?
Modeling practices in calculus.
And that's the name of the curriculum that you're
correct.
using, okay,
Yes.
across the treatments.
Yep.
Okay, I think there are other questions, but let's leave them to the end. I think they're better there.
All right, sounds good. Okay, so then, all right, the next thing that we're going to look at are the changes in that pre-calculus proficiency. All right, so this is just the pre and post of the overall scores for the MPC and the non-MPC, so the treatment versus control. All right, and so of course the first thing is that we saw is that there is a significant gain in the raw scores for the MPC group, and there is a significant decrease in scores for the non-MPC group, right? So this is good for MPC because it means that, well, students are actually doing better with these pre-calculus topics at the end of the semester, which is good. Also, something that I want to point out is that, so right now in the pre, we see there's a significant difference between the MPC and non-MPC. The non-MPC actually had a higher pre-score than the MPC did. Now in the unpaired data, so with just all the students who took the pre, right, regardless of if they stuck around or not, that difference is not significant. So they were actually scoring about the same. Now, the reason why we speculate that this could have happened is that in the non-MPC courses, it could be that the students who started with a lower pre-calculus proficiency ended up dropping the course. And so they weren't there to take the post. And so therefore they are not reflected in the graph that's here. So yes, so I did just want to point that out. All right, so we also looked at some changes in proficiency for a couple of key demographics. All right, so we looked at female students, low pre-level, so students who started at a low pre-level. And for us, low meant that they scored less than 11. So remember the PCA was scored out of 25. So if they scored less than 11, they were considered low proficiency. And then also freshmen and sophomore, because we were interested in how these students who are underclassmen, how their proficiency was changing, given that they're probably the ones who's more likely to either make a decision about a major or maybe like switch out at some point if they were going to do so. So what we saw is that for the MPC sections, all subgroups were showing positive significant gains, which was good for us. But that initial low proficiency group is the one who's actually showing the largest gain, right? So they're the ones who their pre-calculus proficiency is being impacted the most in this model. But then the largest difference that we see between the two groups happens in that underclassmen group, right? So those freshmen and sophomores, that's where like the largest difference actually happens. All right. So yes, so again, we see that the MPC model is still being quite impactful, at least in terms of pre-calculus proficiency for the overall group, but then also for specific subgroups of students. Right? All right, and so yes, since it was, I guess, hypothesized that if a student starts calculus with a low proficiency in calculus, they'd probably be less likely to pass the course, right? Because maybe they need a little more extra help to catch up and things like that. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to see, well, how much impact is this particular model having on students who start with low pre-calc proficiency, right? So this is all the students who started with low proficiency, so if they scored less than 11, and it kind of gives their course outcome. So if they passed, failed, or if they dropped, all right? So what we found was that MPC students who do start with the low proficiency are still more likely to pass the course, all right? And actually, when we did a logistic regression, we found that the odds of passing the course actually increased by 85% for these MPC students, right? Also, something that we noticed was that the initial low proficiency students in MPC, they're actually passing at rates that are similar to the overall MPC group. So this particular table, I think this uses the data from fall 19. And in that semester, the overall MPC group had a pass rate of about 76%, right? Which is kind of close to what the low proficiency students were doing, while the non-MPC group had an overall pass rate of about 68%, right? And so that difference there is a little bit more pronounced for the non-MPC group who were able to pass, right? So again, good thing that, okay, so a student can start with low proficiency, go through this model, and still be able to be successful in the course, which is also a very good sign for us in this model. All right. Oh, yeah.
Charity, here's a question. Several folks have asked about whether the assessments and grading scales were the same for both courses, and I would even ask the same or cross sections with once in the treatment or the control. So was that something that you tried to norm?
So the assessments, them like the exams and things like that.
Yeah, and how grades were determined, I guess.
Okay.
Thinking.
So yeah. Okay. So for how professors decided how to pass the course. Now, there is a common grading scale for all Calc 1 courses since it's technically coordinated. So everyone is supposed to adhere to that. But of course, how professors grade their exams, how they do homework, what percentage they prescribe to which one, that does vary. So there's a little bit of variation there. But the final exam, that was common. So that was the one thing that we wanted to keep a baseline so that we could know exactly what was happening. So the course passing rates, those can, be a little iffy sometimes, but that final exam, that's exactly why we wanted to make sure that everyone got the exact same thing so that we could have a direct comparison there.
So a related question, you had mentioned earlier that, and this is something we really see in the community colleges, that across sections of the same course at the same college, there's huge variability in success rates. I think you had mentioned that earlier as an issue. Did you find that using this common curriculum reduced the variation you saw in success rates across sections?
Yes, it did. And that data may be in the supplement for the science paper, I'm not sure. But yes, but we did find that those things started to kind of even out a lot more with the MPC model. So yes.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so I think so here we are. All right, so what did we learn? All right, so first thing, students in the MPC are more likely to succeed in the course. They were also less likely to drop the course, which of course leads to higher retention rates for STEM majors, because that means that they can go on to the next course. Also, when we were talking about those final exam questions, we saw that the MPC sections are performing better on conceptual calculus problems. So this is helpful for us because that means that some of these skills may transfer to future math and STEM courses. Also, we found that the classroom environment is more effective for students who may be considered not as prepared for calculus and who have lower attitudes towards math. Students in MPC are also developing their pre-calculus proficiency, right? So we saw that across all the key demographics, they were showing much higher gains, and especially true for the people who came in with a lower pre-calculus proficiency. This is also important because those foundational skills, they don't go away. The skills you need in Calc 1, the skills you're going to need in Calc 2, and probably other science courses, right? And we think that the reason is because that students in the MPC are being given more opportunities to develop these skills, right? So like I was saying before, they're expected to show proper work. They're expected to justify their answer. They're expected to use correct notation and representations. So they're always forced to kind of practice these things. And they may not be getting those opportunities if they're in a traditional lecture course. And then finally, the students in MPC are showing gains or smaller decreases in attitudes, all right? So the negative impact on attitudes in MPC sections were smaller. And And that disruption to the changes in attitudes was especially highlighted in the self-confidence and enjoyment subscales. And then we also saw that female students were doing a lot better in terms of their self-confidence. And so we can even consider this to be a gender equalizer in terms of that. All right, so then just some other observations along the way. Group work works. It's students don't necessarily like it at first, but then like in the middle of the semester, they're like begging to work in groups. Also, I find that it just really helps students who may be struggling. They're a lot more comfortable asking a group member for help than they may be asking like me, especially if it's like in front of the whole class. They're way more comfortable to just like turn to the person next to them and say, hey, do you know how to do this? All right. Also, the use of the LAs is quite essential for us. Again, like I was saying, students are way more comfortable asking each other for help than sometimes they are me. The LA is someone who is close to them in age, is someone who has recently taken this course. And so the LAs are probably the people who get the most questions during each class day. Also, the low stakes environment contributes to the students' willingness to participate, right? So when they're using these whiteboards, when they're in their small groups, they don't feel so much pressure to always get the right answer, right? Because the good thing about a whiteboard, if it's wrong, they can easily erase it, right? And they can be like, oh, let me go back and change something. And so this kind of like low stakes environment kind of makes them a little bit more willing to try. And then finally, the importance of messaging and student buy-in. So if you've ever maybe like taught an active learning course, students can be a little hesitant at first, especially in a math course where they're probably used to someone just standing at the front of the classroom and just like giving them all the information. And so when you tell them, hey, that's not going to happen, you have to do the work yourself, they kind of balk at that and they're like, whoa, what do you mean you're not going to teach me? And so kind of the messaging and the why we're doing this, making sure we hammer that in during like that beginning of the semester is very important. That is something that we discovered across like each semester, is the importance of just explaining to students that there is a reason that we're doing this. We have found that it helps, and we just ask for, for you to at least try it this way and, see what happens. And then finally, just like what's next. So kind of just some things that we have been interested in looking at. So kind of like looking at students in next courses. So after they pass Calc 1, seeing like how they do in their next course. So like Calc 2 or like whatever like next math course that they take, to see if there is some kind of transfer of skills and knowledge happening there. Also looking at graduation and persistence rates. So students who have gone through the MPC model, do they tend to graduate with a STEM degree still? So do they still tend to keep pursuing that degree that they wanted? Also, the faculty who are involved in teaching these courses, kind of like how their ideas of teaching have evolved during the teaching of one of these courses. So also looking at that. And then finally, just fidelity of implementation. So once we open the number of sections that are doing this, there's probably like more of a variety of like how people are using the MPC model. And just seeing like things that maybe some people may add that also help, right? So something that we should add to the overall model and things like that. So yes, just looking at the different implementations of this particular model. And so yeah, I think that is it. So I do want to acknowledge the project team who were very vital in all of this research. Laird Kramer, who is the PI of the Catalyzing Change in Calculus project, and then Eddie Fuller, Adam Castillo, Pablo Duran, and Jeff Potvin. And then, of course, all of our research assistants who helped us with the scoring of the final exams. And of course, like I said, the learning assistants whose help has been invaluable in helping our students during this time. So I think.
So Charity, I think there are quite a few questions that maybe play right off those last few slides.
Okay, perfect.
There are a set of questions I think are what I would sort of put under the equity umbrella. One is curious, knowing that you are a Hispanic-serving institution, and many of our community colleges in California also are HSI status. Folks were curious if the success rates and outcomes were disaggregated by race or ethnicity, and if you could say a bit about those findings. And I know that was on some of your previous slides, but maybe you could review
So yeah,
what you discovered
for
there.
let me go back. I'll go to this one, right? So yeah, so for Hispanic students, yes, we definitely see significant increases in course success. For Black students, so we were interested in how Black students were being affected. The thing is that there are a smaller number of Black students. It's not representative of the entire university population, the number who are actually in the Calc 1 courses. And so we don't have a lot of power when we look at that particular subgroup. So that's why also those error bars that you see there are longer, because there's not a lot happening there. But that is something that we have looked at. And so again, we do see that students in the treatment sections are performing better. It's just that we don't have a lot of power for certain subgroups to be able to like say something, statistically significant or something like that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Then there's some more sort of technical questions. How many learning assistant folks do you have typically in a classroom? Are they there the whole class period? How are they trained?
Okay, so there are usually 2 LAs per section. They are there the entire class time. And the way that they are trained, so for one, to be an LA, a student has to take a LA seminar course, which is kind of like a pedagogy course, which kind of like gives them the training for how to be in the classroom. It kind of teaches them how to ask the right questions, how to foster discussion, things like that. But then also during the week, we meet with our LAs just to go over the material for that week and just to like prep them for, hey, this is like the activity that we're doing. These are kind of like some of the questions that you can anticipate. These are probably like where students tend to struggle the most. So just be prepared to, see things like this. So yeah, so that's kind of like how their training works.
All right, then there are a set of questions, which I think I mentioned to you prior to the presentation, that we're in a situation in the California community colleges now where we have legislation that is designed to improve calculus completion, and it focuses on placement and initial enrollment. And just this week, we've heard several reports, pretty extensive reports by the Research and Planning Group from California, who did statewide and local studies. And we're finding that students who start in preparatory courses like college algebra or trig prior to calculus, there's very, very high rates of attrition, even for students who've been successful in the first course that they took. And then the same students at the same, I shouldn't say same, but students with the same level of high school math preparation or high school GPA who start directly in calculus are much more likely to complete. So as a result, our state is moving toward, in the next couple of years, the mainstreaming of more students directly into STEM calculus. So there are a series of questions around, and I guess I could sort of summarize these as you talked some about, and I was very interested in your paper on this too. So folks, again, one of the papers that Charity wrote that was focused just on the low proficiency pre-calculus students and the impact of this pedagogy and curriculum on their not only calculus success, but pre-calculus skill development. So I guess I would ask the question of, we are in a situation where we're going to end up with probably more students in calculus who have not had a pre-calculus course. And if you could help us think through, do you feel that the low pre-calculus proficiency students are going to be sort of similar to those students, or do you have suggestions for ways in which the model might be effective or adjusted to work with students who maybe haven't had a pre-calculus experience?
Yeah, so I will say, so okay, so we do have something called a pre-calculus reference document that we give students on the first day. Uh, so just to be like, hey, just some of this stuff you probably forgot. So here's this document, and we give them an activity that's also like along those lines to work on. And so we tell them like, if at any point we get to a certain topic that we know that is going to directly refer to something from that document, we always say, hey, remember this from the pre-calculus reference document, look at this, right? And so I would think that maybe having something like that, but that's a lot more like expanded, right? So maybe like a set of like supplemental notes for these students and that's like matches up with like certain topics. So I know, for example, like with the chain rule, I always have to go over like composition and decomposition so that they know how to identify like certain functions. So like when it's time to do the chain rule, maybe it's time to say, hey, let's remember, or let's like go over what a composition function is, how we identify it, how we like break it apart, and then go from there. So I would imagine that there could be something like that. And I do think that would be helpful because we have had students who will come to us and say like, hey, I never took pre-calculus, but they still put me in this class. So what do I do? And I'm like, well, I guess we're gonna write it out and see what happens. And most times those students are still successful, right? So it's kind of like maybe like a just in time kind of teaching, or just like a learning like as as you go. So
That's helpful because I think that ties right into the recommendations that are, well, not actually recommendations, requirements now that are made by the state chancellor's office for us to develop co-requisite support with calculus. So instead of having a prior learning experience, they're going to have a concurrent learning experience
yes.
that integrates the pre-calculus into the calculus. Okay, last question. Is the curriculum that you've described here available, or and then also people wanted to know around the final exam, is that something that was written especially for this project, the randomized controlled trial, or is it something the college had already been using?
So yes, the curriculum is available. We actually have some schools in Texas, other schools in Florida who are currently using it. I think, and I'd have to talk to the rest of the team. I think the way that we have it is that like if you're going to use it, then we just ask you to kind of give us feedback on it, like how you used it, if you changed anything, how your students responded to it, all of that. Also, what we do is for faculty who are using it, we have kind of these weekly or sometimes bi-weekly meetings just to see like how things are going, also to like offer support, if they say like, oh, like my groups aren't working well together, like what can I do? Like kind of like that, just like logistical and like the small stuff that happens throughout the semester. So
sort of a community of practice kind
yes,
of looser, yeah.
yes, exactly.
Okay, great.
Um,
All
and then,
right, so
was there another? I'm sorry. I feel
the
like
final exam, I think they wanted to know if you had
oh,
written a
so yes. So the final exams, the one that we used was actually written by all the instructors teaching control and treatment, right? So we didn't want to bias it by us just making the final exam or by the control sections just making the final exam. And so we made sure that everyone had input for the final exam, that everyone agreed that, yes, this is fair for my students and all of that. So it was something that was kind of like a group effort to make the final exam.
So one last question then, if the curriculum is available, folks want to know how to get access to it. Is that something that I could
Yes,
share on the
so
CAP website?
you
Or?
can, here, I'm gonna go back to, there you go. You can send me an email here and I will get you all the information that you need.
Okay, great.
Yep.
So we are about out of time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to remind folks that we will be posting the Dr. Watson slides and the presentation on the CAP website, accelerationproject.org. In addition to the articles that we have mentioned today that have been published, You will also find on the California Acceleration Project website under events, our future events and community of practice opportunities that are all focused on STEM calculus this semester. And be sure to check out the blog that Professor Kelly Spoon has been sharing, where she is talking about a lot of things that are similar to Dr. Watson's design principles for the MPC curriculum. And Kelly is teaching her co-rec with Calculus 1 open access and sort of documenting her experiences, sharing her strategies this semester. And I think, don't you, Dr. Watson, know Professor
I do
Spoon
know.
from
I do. Yeah.
from AP stats grading or something?
Yes, from AP
Yeah,
Stats.
that's
Yeah.
so cool. All right, so we want to, again, thanks everyone, and we'll get things posted soon. Appreciate you coming today. So Charity, I'm going to cut off the recording and
All right,
then
I will
we
stop.
can.
There we go.